On 6th July, the VRS started its military attack on the Srebrenica enclave, an operation known as Krivaja 95. Several days of intense shelling followed, with Srebrenica town and the compounds and observation points of the Dutch Battalion of Amprofor, which I shall be referring to as Dutchbat, being amongst the targets. On 11 July, the enclave, including the town of Srebrenica, fell. As a result of the attack, from 10th July, thousands of Bosnian Muslims started fleeing from Srebrenica town to the Dutchbat compound in Potocari, desperate for protection. While mostly women, children and the elderly fled to Potocari, Bosnian Muslim men from Srebrenica gathered in villages in the valleys of the Srebrenica enclave. In the late evening, these men formed a column which set off in the direction of Tuzla, which was in the territory held by the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'll be referring to this army as ABIH. In order to reach Tuzla, the column had to break through VRS-held positions. The column consisted of about 10 to 15,000 individuals, mostly men, and with both a civilian and a military component. Meanwhile, 3 meetings took place between representatives from the VRS and Dutchbat at the Hotel Fontana in Bratunac over 11th and 12th July. So-called unofficial representatives of the Bosnian Muslim population also attended the second and third meetings. The parties discussed the logistics of moving over 10,000 Bosnian Muslims from Potocari and its surroundings, and Mladic told the Bosnian Muslim representatives, quote, "You can either survive or disappear. For your survival, I demand that all your armed men surrender their weapons to the VRS," unquote. By the morning of 12th July, a decision had been taken to separate the Bosnian Muslim men in Potocari and execute them. On that same day, the VRS dispatched approximately 50 buses to Potocari, where members of the Bosnian Serb forces, that is, VRS forces, Ministry of the Interior in Republika Srpska, MUP forces, began separating men aged 15 to 65 from the women, children and the elderly who were boarding the buses. Already on the verge of a humanitarian disaster, a night of utter misery ensued at the Dutchbat compound. People were frightened, some died. Members of the Bosnian Serb forces took away men who did not return, and women were heard screaming, "Let me go," and "Please don't." The transfer and separations continued throughout the next day. Members of the Bosnian Serb forces confiscated and eventually burnt the separated men's belongings, including passports and identity papers, and detained the men at various houses in Potocari. They were given no food, hardly any water, and sanitary facilities were scarce. Members of the Bosnian Serb forces transported the separated men towards Bratunac. The Bosnian Serb forces thwarted efforts by Dutchbat soldiers to escort the convoys and record the men's names. On 13 July, there were several random killings of Bosnian Muslims by members of the Bosnian Serb forces, including at the Luk school and in Potocari. By the evening of 13 July, between 20 and 30,000 Bosnian Muslims had been bussed out to ABIH-held territory, and no Bosnian Muslims remained in Potocari or Srebrenica. The trial chamber has found that this constituted forcible transfer including by majority Judge Kwon dissenting with respect to the civilian component of the column. Meanwhile, on 12th and 13th July, the VRS deployed several units along various routes in order to engage militarily and block the column of Bosnian Muslims that was moving from Srebrenica to Tuzla. By this point, the murder plan originally directed at the men in Potocari was extended to Bosnian Muslim men who were captured or surrendered from the column. By 13th July, Bosnian Serb forces had detained approximately 6,000 Bosnian Muslim prisoners in the Bratunac area. The prisoners were forced to surrender their property, which included identity cards, wallets, watches, and food. They were kept in cramped conditions and received some water, although hardly any food. Members of the Bosnian Serb forces did not ask or record names. Some of those of the detained prisoners became victims of opportunistic killings. On 13th July, VRS Commander Ratko Mladic issued a telling order prohibiting filming and photographing of prisoners and preventing access by, quote, unauthorized, unquote, and, quote, uninvited, unquote, entities. At the same time, a series of meetings were held over 13th and 14th July between members of the civilian authorities and VRS members, at which the logistics of the killing and burial operations were the central objects. On 13th July, the murder operation began in earnest. Members of the Bosnian Serb forces shot and killed Bosnian Muslim prisoners on the banks of the Jadar River, at an area along a dirt road in Cerska Valley, the Bratunac Brigade headquarters, and Sandici Meadow, and in and around the Vuk Karadzic school in Bratunac town. On the same day, Bosnian Muslim prisoners who were captured or surrendered from the column close to Sandici Meadow were marched or transported to the nearby Kravica warehouse. There, what appears to be a busload of prisoners were initially killed after a prisoner had grabbed a weapon, killing one member of the Bosnian Serb forces and wounding others. What followed this initial killing episode can only be described as a massacre of the prisoners held in the warehouse. Members of the Bosnian Serb forces besieged the prisoners with gunfire and grenades. The assault upon the prisoners lasted through the night. By the end, at least 1,000 Bosnian Muslim men had been killed. Excavators arrived on 14th and 15th of July to remove the bodies. Further mass executions followed in Zvornik shortly after. Over 13th to 17th July, the detained Bosnian Muslim men were taken by the Bosnian Serb forces in buses and trucks from Bratunac to various places of detention in Zvornik. The men endured a brief but horrific period of detention in various public buildings, mainly schools. The facilities were woefully inadequate. The men were taunted along ethnic lines and largely denied food and water. An atmosphere of terror was maintained through beatings and sporadic executions. Their spirits broken, the Bosnian Muslim men were taken for execution. Some were blindfolded and their hands were tied, and at one detention site they were given a final glass of water. Then they were transported to nearby locations and shot. This scene played out at a field in Orahovac, a dam at Petkovci, a gravel pit in Kozluk, and a farm in Pilica. In addition, hundreds were killed inside the Pilica Cultural Center, an execution for which there are no known survivors. Loaders and excavators were either already at the sites at the time of the executions or arrived soon after to bury the dead in mass graves. In the wake of these mass executions, the Bosnian Serb forces ordered a so-called mopping up operation throughout the enclave, and executions on a smaller scale continued in the Zvornik area between the 16th and the 27th of July 1995. The members of the column who had not surrendered or been captured had continued to move towards ABIH territory. By 15th July, the column had reached the Zvornik Brigade's area of responsibility, and heavy fighting took place. However, on 16th and 17th July, a corridor several hundred meters wide was opened in the defense lines of the Bosnian Serb forces, allowing a significant part of the column to pass to ABIH-held territory. These Bosnian Muslim men escaped the murder operation. During September and October 1995, in an effort to conceal the killings, the VRS, with the assistance of the civilian authorities, carried out a large-scale operation in the areas of Zvornik and the Bratnac brigades, during which bodies of execution victims were moved from their primary graves to secondary locations.